The Whips have agreed that the following matters will be considered next. Item 19, the motion on property taxes, paragraph 3 of report number 2 on homelessness, and paragraph 9 of report number 2 on Vauxhall 9 Elms. So I now call on Councillor Senior to formally move and Councillor Govindia to second the motion on property taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I could formally move item 19.
Councillor Cuff. Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Mayor. I seem to be here tonight. Thank you very much for this debate. I will have to say, when I was walking around London today wearing 9 or 10 layers of clothing, trying to avoid, in the heart of winter, the various legions of the ill that seem to grip London at this time of year, from the various Christmas flus and Christmas excesses that everyone seems to indulge in. I did think it would be very strange for me tonight to sit here and debate a discussion on the autumn statement in the heart of winter. And I do sometimes struggle with Treasury terms that come out of the Treasury, the Chancellor's office. And I think now at least I do understand the term when they talk about seasonally adjusted figures. I have to say, jumping from autumn to spring and avoiding winter altogether, which is of course what the Chancellor has done, it would seem to me that the autumn statement has brought us a bit of spring cheer, certainly for both parties, I think. Firstly, from the Conservatives' point of view, we have the spring cheer of seeing the rather onerous stamp duty, which I think most people felt sat very uncomfortably with, this sort of cliff system of its structure, whereby you'd get over a certain point and you would jump into a new tax regime. It's welcome to see that smoothed out. And I think probably from the Labour's point of view, it is an opportunity for them to kill off the rather embarrassing policy that they had on mansion tax. And certainly I think that is evident of the policy which wasn't going in the right direction when Myling Class famously gave the leader of their party a good flogging on television. But probably more noticeably, what was interesting was when probably the leading front runner for the Labour Party candidature for the mayoralty, although she's yet to announce it, publicly disassociated herself from the policy. So it really is a bit of a pup. I'm very much looking forward to two speakers who are colleagues of mine who are making their maiden speeches tonight, so I won't dwell too much on stamp duty or indeed the Labour's mansion tax, other than to say it's clearly a policy that the Chancellor's announced on its reform of stamp duty, which will lift a lot of cost out of the majority of homeowners in this country, and indeed it will deal with some of the distortions around the thresholds for stamp duty, which result in property prices being out of kilter with the market. So I think that's all to be supported, and I look forward to hearing what my colleagues say. Ed Miliband really isn't having a great time, is he? It's very interesting. He has the look to me of someone who has never successfully interrupted someone else's conversation, which is interesting. And I think if I was going to interrupt a conversation of his, probably not in as much of an aggressive style as Myling Class did, although it was a very effective way of keeping him quiet, I would say to him that actually there is a mansion tax of sorts in this country as it is. It is, of course, our council tax, which, as a concept, I think is a very sound concept as a policy goes, as a tax system goes. Unfortunately, it's become a grotesque impost as a tax, and the reason for that, and it is probably the walking dead of property taxes out there, is because no one's bothered to revalue it since 1991, which is extraordinary really. It seems to have been forgotten about, or it's just too difficult to deal with. But the result is that we have this enormous bunching of properties, as we all know, in Band H. Everything that was worth, I think, £325,000 in 1992 is now bunched in there. And what that means in boroughs like Westminster, I won't use the example of Wandsworth, you have oligarchs and pensioners alike paying the same level of council tax in Band H, which is extraordinary, really. And also extraordinary that they probably raise more money from parking than they do from their residents' tax base. So, it's clearly a policy, it's clearly a tax system which needs reform. And there is a solution, isn't there? We've all talked about it many times in the past, even in this chamber and in many other forums too, and that of course is to add more bans. It doesn't sound that radical, but of course I guess when the Treasury and successive governments have looked at it from a Whitehall perspective, the logical consequence of adding more bans of course is that more money comes to town halls and not to Whitehall, and therefore, oh dear, that's not good because we can't let the town halls take money and spend it. And so as a result, unfortunately, council tax seems to be, as a reform of that policy, seems to be constantly off the agenda, which is incredibly disappointing because the contention, the point I would make, and probably one thing that we all agree on here, I think, is that actually the heart of the council tax system is right. It's the edges which are wrong. And if we can get the edges right, then actually we've probably got a sustainable financial settlement. Anyway, have a great Christmas, everyone. It's been a great debate so far tonight. I'm going to get really drunk in a minute. See you later.
Councillor Carpenter, follow that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the light of the majority party's earlier comments about playing party politics, I'm surprised that they haven't withdrawn their own motion. Mr. Mayor, I've previously declared an interest in this motion, as I'm one of those likely to be affected by a tax on properties valued above £2 million. I am very touched by the concern for my financial welfare shown by the majority party in this motion, and for the financial welfare of others in the top 1% of wealth distribution, who are likely to be affected by any such tax. It's surprising that the majority party is not showing equal concern for the financial welfare of the 4 times greater number who are being asked to pay higher stamp duty payments as a result of the changes announced in the autumn statement. Some people with values of houses between 1 and 2 million will face additional taxes of up to £50,000. It's also a pity that the majority party does not show equal concern for the welfare of those in the bottom 10% of income and wealth distribution, who've been hit disproportionately hard by increases in the price of basic necessities such as housing, food and fuel, and reductions in welfare benefits. It is because of this hypocrisy at the heart of the majority party's motion that we are opposing it. The members opposite remind me of the sheep in Animal Farm, but this time chanting, Tory tax good, Labour tax bad. Let us be clear why Labour is proposing a tax on properties valued above £2 million. It is to raise £1.2 billion a year to invest in the NHS, part of a £2.5 billion package of investment to provide 20,000 more nurses and 8,000 more doctors. This investment is required because of the inadequate investment in the NHS by the current Conservative-led government, who are more interested in their failed programme to eliminate the deficit than in the health of the nation. Their increase in VAT from 15% to 20% in 2010 stopped the country's economic recovery in its tracks, and the economy flatlined for 3 years. As a result, after 5 years of coalition government, Britain's economy is still smaller than it was before the recession in 2008, the slowest recovery in living history. It is this failure to grow the economy that is at the heart of the government's economic failure. The deficit of £90 billion a year when it should have been eliminated. Debt is still growing and is at 80% of GDP when it should be falling. To get an idea of the scale of this failure, debt was regularly 40% of GDP before the recession. The coalition government has succeeded in doubling it. Now let's bring these numbers down to earth. Every family in the country is £1,600 a year worse off than it was before the coalition government came to power. And that's after taking account of the increases in income tax thresholds. And it gets worse. George Osborne wants to make more spending cuts in the next 5 years than he has done over the past 5 years. David Cameron has promised £7 billion of unfunded tax giveaways. We all know what the effect of 5 years' cuts to Wandsworth's budget has been. After another 5 years' cuts, we won't just be raiding the reserves. We won't have any reserves left to raid. Wandsworth will be bankrupt and we'll have to put the officers out on the streets. Not a very festive thought as we approach Christmas. Mr Mayor, the motion expresses concern for those who have seen the value of their property increase fortuitously over the years. These are windfall gains, and in all other asset categories they are rightly subject to capital gains tax at 28%. The tax being proposed by Labour is £3,000 a year on a £2 million property, 0.15% of its value, less than a hundredth of the capital gains tax which will be imputed. The motion expresses concern that people on modest incomes would not be able to pay £3,000 a year. The Shadow Chancellor has made it clear that anyone who does not pay higher rate income tax and so has an income of under £40,000 a year will have the option of deferring the tax until the property is sold. And finally, the motion expresses concern that this is a tax on London. On the contrary, it is a tax on high-value property wherever it is located. In conclusion, Mr Mayor, this is a hypocritical motion from a majority party that is more interested in protecting the wealth of the top 10% than in the welfare of the bottom 10%. In the interests of fairness and equality, I urge you to reject the motion. Thank you.
I now invite Councillor Dodd to make her maiden speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I was interested to hear what Councillor Carpenter was saying. As far as I was concerned, we're currently doing fine. Our economy is recovering, currently, of course, so let's hope Labour don't get in next year, otherwise everything will go to pot again. But I strongly believe that Labour's so-called mansion tax is not a sensible way forward, and of course I'm not the only one. At the recent public Let's Talk meeting for my ward, which is Northcote Ward, the leader for the opposition, Councillor Osborne, said that the mansion tax would penalise the asset-rich and cash-poor. He also added that it did not have the full support of Labour members. But a mansion tax is simply not necessary, as I will demonstrate. So what I really want to start by looking at is what the National Labour Party think they will achieve with a mansion tax. I don't mean what the money raised by imposing it would be used for. Of course, there are any number of good uses extra money could be put to in the current climate. What I really mean is what is the reason behind inventing a whole new tax and all the administration that it entails, targeted at those owning properties worth £2 million or more. The National Labour Party's own website states, "We think that owners and investors in properties worth tens of millions of pounds should make a much bigger contribution." It also says, "We will look at asking overseas owners of second homes in the UK to make a larger contribution than people living in their only home." So one of the aims is certainly the redistribution of property wealth, but also here appears to be, to me, an implied interest in addressing London's empty home problem. Whilst I maintain that the mansion tax is a bad idea, the empty home problem certainly does merit closer inspection in my view. However, in Wandsworth, this is currently really not a big issue. Recent data suggests that less than about 0.3% of our total properties are actually empty. That's fewer than 400 out of a total of around 136,000. Of course, the same cannot be said of other London boroughs, which have been dubbed as suffering from the buy-to-leave phenomenon. The thing is, looking at the purpose of a mansion tax from a redistribution of property wealth angle, it is clear that the current taxes already in action already have this covered, as the autumn statement has further strengthened the position. So we have, for example, stamp duty reform, as has already been detailed by Councillor Cuff. Also already in existence, the annual tax on envelope dwellings, or ATID, applies to UK residential properties over 500k, owned via an envelope, such as a company. This is a targeted anti-avoidance tax. If owners still choose to purchase via a company, they will pay a 15% stamp duty up front, an annual charge and a capital gain on selling that company. The autumn statement increased this tax. So these taxes already target those purchasing high-value properties, and if they're purchased via an envelope, ATID provides an annual tax to counteract perceived avoidance. And there have also been increased remittance charges on non-domiciles who live in the UK. Moving now to a couple of taxes targeting the empty property issue. First off, capital gains tax main residence relief. Now this is the relief whereby individuals can sell their main residence without being hit by capital gains tax, and this will no longer apply to non-residents from April 2015. And in addition, we in Wandsworth have removed council tax discounts for empty properties and second homes. These discounts, as most of you will know, existed under central government rules, but in April 2013 we were given the discretion to take these discounts away, and we acted on this immediately. Now, the tax rules are used primarily to raise revenue, as we all know, but it is generally agreed that this should be done via a tax system which is fair, clear and equivalent. So taxes are commonly introduced to target tax avoidance or to level the playing field. By contrast, the mansion tax would effectively punish owners of residential property who have done nothing wrong. Sure, some of them are rich. Others have a house and no income. They haven't been trying to avoid tax. They've done nothing wrong. Anyone about to buy a property in the future can currently make a clear decision based on the price of the property and any associated tax as to whether they can afford that property or not. This isn't the way a mansion tax would work. It taxes you after the fact and can depend on whether market forces over which you have no control push your house into the taxable zone. Now, the number of properties worth over 2 million in Wandsworth is around 2,600, nearly 2% of the total. Now, I appreciate no one can feel too sorry for anyone with a property that is in that taxable zone. Even if they are cash poor, they can always downsize and pay a mansion tax, right? Agreed, they can. But my point is that there are much better ways of dealing with this issue using the tax system we already have. Why introduce yet another tax with its well-documented administration and collection issues when we already have tax systems in place to do the job? So to conclude, the mansion tax is redundant. We already have taxes designed to target high-value residential homeowners and empty properties. And in addition, I agree with Councillor Cuff, perhaps the time is now right for a review of the out-of-date council tax bans. But ultimately, let's use the taxes we already have in place to do the job. I urge you to vote in favour of this motion. Thank you.
Councillor MacDonald, please.
Mr Mayor, I have yet to meet anyone who likes paying taxes, but there is a general held principle here, and I would hope that everyone in this room would agree with it, that taxes are a necessary evil. And we also have a principle in the Western world that those who earn the most should pay the most. And indeed, perhaps that was the driving principle behind the Chancellor's autumn statement when he proposed his reforms to stamp duty last week, because the changes he made suggested that he agrees with Labour that at the moment high-value properties are highly undertaxed. And so because of this current unfairness in the system, and I would also agree with Councillor Cuff, we have a system for taxing property that is exceptionally out of date. I mean, I can remember it coming in 1991 too, and it's also highly unfair. How can it be fair that the average person is paying 390 times more in council tax than a billionaire living in a penthouse in Mayfair? And so this is why Labour is proposing the mansion tax, and perhaps I'll correct a few inaccuracies that are doing the rounds on this tax. This tax will not be paid by those who are asset rich and cash poor, because those on incomes less than £42,000 will be able to defer payment of the tax. They will be able to defer payment of the tax until the property is sold. It's a tax that actually only affects a very, very small number, and I did some of my own research on this last night, and rather than relying on a property website, I looked at the official land registry figures. And the most up-to-date figures for August of this year show that out of 10,100 properties sold across London, only 197 of them, or that's 1.9%, were in excess of 2 million. So we're talking about a tax that is going to affect a very, very small number of the very wealthy. And that money is going to go towards funding much-needed services in the NHS. And it's perhaps that sense of fairness behind this tax that has got popular opinion behind it. And a YouGov poll for the Evening Standard in August of this year actually found that the majority of Londoners do support this tax, and even a majority of Conservative voters in London support this tax. But the motion that we are debating here tonight, it isn't based on what is fair, and it's not based on what the people of Wandsworth want. It's based on the usual instinct of the Conservative administration to support the interests of a very privileged few to the detriment of everyone else. And in fact, the entire debate that we've had here all evening, from start to finish, demonstrates that we have a Tory administration which is only interested in protecting the interests of a small number. As we've heard earlier this evening, they've got plans to privatise the Tooting athletics track, which will risk that it becomes unaffordable for local schools. And as we're hearing it now with their opposition to this mansion tax, and if we ever get to the adjournment debate, although I'm a bit confused about how that's working out, we will also hear from Councillor Hogg about the crisis in homelessness that's coming into this borough and the woeful response that we have from this administration to that homelessness crisis. But what the Tories are failing to grasp, what you're failing to grasp every time here, is that in seeking to protect the interests of a few and neglecting the many, you're actually failing all of us. You're failing everyone in the borough. Because who wants to live in a borough where you don't champion and you don't value sports? Who wants to live in a borough where homelessness is on the rise? Who wants to live in a borough where we aren't prepared to use taxes to invest in frontline services? And I think the answer is that actually, whether your home is worth 2 million or it's worth 200,000, whether you own your home or you rent your home, you want to be part of a community and you want to have decent public services. And that requires taxation, and it requires fair taxation. That's why I urge everyone to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Mr Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the Council for 30 seconds as per the motion I circulated earlier.
Do you have a seconder?
May I speak?
Yes, do.
Thank you. I'd like to apologise for the manner of this debate. The whips had indicated the guillotine would be used. I now leave it up to them whether they allow the previous debate to continue after this adjournment. I very much regret we are having this debate. In July, when we last debated it, the situation was shocking, and it's got worse. The number of local families homeless in our council temporary accommodation at that point was going to rise from 790 at the start of the year to a predicted 900 by the end of the year. And now the situation has become desperate. The Housing Committee this month, we're told that the prediction is now 1,100 families by year end. This is an annual increase of 329 homeless families, more than double the 125 we were expecting. I mean, is there any other area of public policy that we're responsible for where we've failed so badly and that has let down so many local families? This crisis was predictable, and of course it was predicted. Most recently in July, this council resolved unanimously to seek ways to reduce the number of homeless families in temporary accommodation over each of the next 4 years. And no effective plan was put in place. And I was genuinely shocked by the complacent response of the cabinet member, whose guile and work rate I used to admire, but he's genuinely losing his touch on this one, and it's just horrible to see. This problem will likely increase next year. Look, no one wins on this issue. It's genuinely just disrespectful when you're kicking it around. We just want to solve it. This can be the time we get a grip on it and roll it backwards. We have the resources to do it. It won't affect council tax at all. We have the money sitting there. Since you first said I was making up this problem, you found £5 million of investment to help deal with it. Since you last said I was exaggerating this problem, you found another £5 million to deal with it. But no one's actually pretending that that's even going to arrest the increase, let alone roll it back. And for years, the problem's been clear. We have encouraged a large and growing private rented sector. I've been part of it. Families, though, unable to buy a home of their own and with no chance of accessing social housing, are trapped renting in that. You then have 10% year-on-year rent increases, bills are going up, and you know, we've sort of created a machine to generate homelessness, and we have to change our system to respond to that. And these aren't people who beg or people who sleep rough. You have almost certainly seen some of them at the school gates. So I asked in July, and I ask again, what level of homelessness are we willing to tolerate? What level will you tolerate? What's the value of a family losing their home? At what stage do we say to officers, your job is actually to tackle this crisis, not just track its increase? And this crisis is causing a shambles in the housing department, which is treating families unacceptably. It decides on just 39% of homeless cases within 33 working days, the target being 66%. During August this year, only 22% of cases were handled within the target time. And the department admits this is in part a result of the staff reorganisation, and that staff reorganisation cut frontline staff to allow for corresponding savings in the council tax. Those savings made from the housing department were then used to fund a pre-election rent freeze. In this town hall, a soon-to-be former employee predicted exactly this outcome at the time of those cuts. The truth is, Wandsworth Housing Department is no longer structured in the best way to serve residents. In many ways, it's now structured in the best way to help lighten the burden on council tax. I mean, the Cabinet member's right. I did outline to the committee and to this council the steps we could take to arrest this council. The Housing Department has £200 million in reserves. It could commit more of that. It could use its existing budgets, money from the government, could work with landlords to prevent the problem upstream. It could build more homes. And crucially, it could actually make sure the developers deliver on their affordable housing responsibilities. Because the primary responsibility of this council is to house our most vulnerable residents, not to try and facilitate the building of yet more luxury homes for overseas buyers. Prevention is better than cure. I'll just conclude, Mr. Mayor. It's time to get ahead of this and end the temporary fixes. We'll save money in the long run by keeping children in school and parents in work. And we need to just say we won't stand for this problem anymore.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think it's actually quite surprising that there should be an adjournment on this, because if the opposition had actually wanted this motion to go forward, they would have put forward more than one speaker for a start. They would also have ensured that it was brought forward earlier in the agenda. They chose to do neither of those things. This, what is in effect amendment, could have come at the Housing Committee, but it didn't. It came through as a last-minute thing today. And I think to actually just say to homeless people, we're going to have 30 seconds to contemplate your predicament, I think is actually rather insulting. I will actually say that homelessness is a huge problem, particularly in inner London. And I got in touch with Shelter, who I think are a fairly reputable organisation. I thought I'd better have a word with them before they went on strike, and to get the comparable homelessness figures for inner London boroughs. And these are all as at Q3 of 2014, so slightly out of date, but reasonably up to date. Wandsworth, they were quoting at 860, Brent 3,393, Camden 526, Hackney 1,772, Hammersmith and Fulham 1,149, Islington 1,000, Kensington Chelsea 1,775, Lambeth 1,648, Newham 2,912, Southwark 848, Tower Hamlets 1,939, Westminster 2,398. Now, clearly, if we're doing so badly, why are we not up there with those figures? The fact is that all these measures that Councillor Hogg has repeated again, which I've already spoken about half an hour ago, we are doing all those things. We're doing all those things. We're getting no new suggestions from them. What we're getting is criticism. I think actually we ought to be praising our officers for the innovative ways that they're going about trying to resolve this problem. We've gone through this before. Was it 10 years ago or something like that? We had much bigger housing problems. That was resolved then. This will be resolved. Of course it's awful for the families concerned. We all know that. But having sort of adjournment debates and contemplating about 30 seconds is not the way to go about it. I suggest that we just reject this nonsense. Just
meetings and shorten the length of the council meetings, then we won't have a debate at all. The other party doing that.
Thank you, Councillor Belton, for your thoughts. Mr. Mayor, everything that is being done, I believe, can be done. Is being done. If Councillor Hogg has any suggestions, I'd be really pleased to see them. In fact, actually, we're very fortunate. We've been discussing leaked documents this evening quite a lot, and I found the Labour Party's solution to the homelessness problem and how to solve it.
Those against the motion? The motion is therefore lost, 15 to 34.
So we now return to the main.
We now return to the main debate, a maiden speech by Councillor Lescott.
That's a relief. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, councillors. I would like to start by formally thanking the people of Earlsfield for electing me as one of their councillors. I also want to thank the former councillors Matthew Maxwell Scott, Charles McNaught Davis and Angela Graham. Each served with distinction and has been a source of valuable advice. Angela Graham in particular represents a shining example of public service and will be regarded with great respect in Earlsfield and the borough for many years to come. So, firstly, and perhaps controversially, and perhaps in a conciliatory manner, I must admit that I don't think the mansion tax is the worst idea Labour has had. Nor does the fact that it was the Lib Dems who first had the idea necessarily count against it. I am told that only one property in Earlsfield would be affected by the mansion tax, and incidentally, it isn't my home. Therefore, it might be fair to assume that my voters will not expect me to die in a ditch opposing it. So what has the measure got going for it? It may help to raise revenue and thereby reduce the deficit. It is in line with the concept of graduated property taxation that the Chancellor confirmed in the autumn statement with his changes to stamp duty land tax. It only affects a small group of people in the most expensive houses. It isn't that expensive as it is levied only on the value of a property above £2 million, and it is apparently popular with the public. But how sensible might introducing such a tax be? Firstly, can it help to reduce the deficit? The prime purpose of a tax should be to raise revenue. Labour claimed that the mansion tax will raise up to £1.2 billion annually. Now let's leave aside the costs of banding properties and administering the new tax and take their word for it. This year, the deficit stands at £97.5 billion. The extra money won't go very far, but every little helps, doesn't it? Well, in this case, none of it will help because Labour is already committed to spending it. They want to put all of it and more towards extra spending on the NHS. Now that may be noble and popular, but by committing to spend more money than it is hoped to raise, this measure will increase the deficit. Central government should be seeking to maximise revenue, and this is hard. The only tax rise since 2010 actually to yield more revenue is the rise in VAT. Perhaps more subtle tax changes are needed. I can only conclude that raising revenue isn't the prime purpose of mansion tax. This brings me to the Chancellor's changes to stamp duty. It could be said about the mansion tax that it unfairly punishes those with a nice house, and that stamp duty unfairly punishes those wanting to buy one. Stamp duty follows the same principle as the mansion tax, that more expensive homes attract a higher percentage on the presumption that the owners can afford it. I far prefer the principle of a flat rate. However, the public seem to accept graduated taxes, and it could be said that the changed stamp duty represents the government's answer to mansion tax. However, there are distinctions between the taxes. Some advantages of stamp duty are that it is predictable. You know what you will have to pay. You only pay it once rather than annually, and it reflects the actual value of a property rather than a deemed value. Also, the mansion tax is retrospective. It applies to owners who bought property with a reasonable expectation that they would not be subject to such a tax. Both taxes may have a distorting effect on the market by suppressing demand. At the lower end, of course, mansion tax has no impact, whereas the stamp duty cuts may actually stimulate demand. It'll be interesting to see how this will affect revenue. Due to house prices far exceeding the rest of the country, mansion tax will unduly hit London properties, particularly Wandsworth. Most of these properties aren't mansions. In addition, 1/3 of properties affected have been owned for over 10 years. Many people forced to pay are not the super rich, but ordinary families who bought a relatively cheap terrace house to live in years ago. It is their good fortune that their property is now worth a great deal more, but they won't have realised this wealth and may be cash poor. It is right that the Labour plans to allow certain people to defer payments in this case, and it is sensible that the charge will only apply to the value of the property above 2 million. Nevertheless, expensive houses are already subject to inheritance tax. Without opening that can of worms, I would say I don't like the principle of hitting people simply for their good fortune. There are over 2,500 houses that would be affected in Wandsworth. The way house prices tend to increase, many more properties will soon be dragged into its scope. This is also a risk with stamp duty. I doubt that thresholds of either tax will be raised in line with London house price inflation. So how might the tax benefit Wandsworth? None of the money raised will be spent directly in Wandsworth, but many residents here will be contributors. Far better to amend council tax bandings and allow councils to spread the burden of council tax more fairly amongst its residents. Mansion tax creams off the top for central government from under councils' noses. The mansion tax is not a tax on mansions. As with other measures, such as the Robin Hood tax, the windfall tax, and indeed the bedroom tax, the term appeals to emotion rather than common sense. It probably won't help to raise lots of revenue. It doesn't address an obvious imbalance in the tax system. It is anti-aspirational and fuels general feeling that financial success is to be punished. It hits London hardest and Wandsworth in particular and has no direct benefit to our residents. Whilst I don't think it represents a major threat from Labour, I think that less ostentatious changes to tax could be of greater benefit. So I will be voting in favour of the motion. Thank you.
Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a great shame that we've wasted so much of this evening's agenda debating an issue that is completely outside the control of this council and which will affect a very small number of its residents. Nevertheless, it provides me with an opportunity to point out to all those up in the public gallery, nice to see you here, and the very many people watching at home on YouTube, how the majority party's values are completely out of kilter with the average Wandsworth resident. As my colleague mentioned earlier, the deficit is currently standing at over £90 billion, and in spite of some promises to the contrary, our current Chancellor has failed to get a grip on this over the past 5 years. And as Councillor Govindia said, whoever's running the country in May 2015, there's going to be tough choices to make if we're going to get Britain's finances back on an even keel. Labour's approach has always been to ensure that if new taxes need to be introduced, they will be borne by those with the broadest shoulders. And frankly, whether or not they feel rich, anyone who owns a property worth more than £2 million isn't just an ordinary family. They're considerably wealthier than 98% of the population, and possibly a lot more than that. They're also incredibly fortunate, and I disagree with Councillor Lescott's point that we don't go around taxing people's good fortune. Well, you know, if they're a bit lucky, actually, I think the money's got to come from somewhere. In most cases, people who live in today's £2 million homes, as you said, bought their property for a song 15 or 30 years ago. The increase in its value doesn't speak to their strategic property investment acumen. It's a result of them being born at the right time and fortuitously entering the property market at the perfect moment. In many other countries around the world, gains such as these are not left untaxed. In the US, for example, only the first $250,000 of capital gains are protected from tax when you sell your primary residence. In Britain, however, the lucky generation have been left to cash in their winnings untouched. Labour's new high value property tax will not change that for the vast majority of people. And for the small minority who are sitting on homes worth more than £2 million, the ask will be incredibly modest. For a £2 to £3 million house, we're talking about £250 a month. And if the family are lower rate taxpayers and don't have the resources to pay, they'll be able to defer the tax until the property is sold. At £3,000 a year, they'll be able to live in the property for 30 years and not even pay 5% of its value. It's also important to point out that the £2 million threshold is going to rise in line with property prices. So only those with properties worth £2 million today are going to be affected. It's not a tax that will encompass ever more and more households. A tax on high-value property is important for two reasons. Apart from the obvious fact that we need more money to protect valued services like the NHS and this council and these council services, we do also need to place some downward pressure on property prices. The gains that the baby boomer generation have made on their properties have come at the cost of a younger generation for whom buying a house is now an aspiration that many of them may never achieve. I'm one of the last to have benefited from the rising property prices, not as much as my elder siblings, but I'd gladly sacrifice every penny of those paper gains if I knew that doing so would shore up the health service, build more schools and ensure that my daughter's generation would have a chance of getting onto the property ladder by working hard and saving up. The alternative is that only the children of those who have property wealth to pass down will have any hope of buying their own home, ensuring the gap between the richest and poorest in our society grows ever wider and the people at the bottom have ever less chance of getting further up and being socially mobile. I'm surprised that the majority party is so opposed to a tax on high-value property. By my count, only 3 councillors in this room will pay it, 2 of them from our benches. And I'm sure if Councillor Clay is struggling, the rest of you lot will be willing to do a whip round. Mr Mayor, regardless of how we got into this economic situation, and I know that we may disagree on that
Can I make a point of personal explanation here?
Yes.
My house was worth more than £2 million. Or in fact, my neighbour's house was worth more than £2 million. And then when the announcement was made for mansion tax, the bottom fell out of the market in Wandsworth and the property prices went down. And that will have gone down for everybody. It will have gone down for everybody.
Order. Go.
It will have gone down for everybody. It's a stymie. It's closing down.
And it has to go down. That is my point. It has to go down. And if it's already had that effect, then it is working. Regardless of what we got here, there are tough decisions to be taken over the years ahead. Where cuts need to be made, we'll always strive to protect the most vulnerable, and that includes protecting the public services that we rely on, as we've talked about tonight. Where more tax needs to be raised, we will seek it from those who have earned the most, who have the most, be that people who earn more than 150 grand a year, or those who have £2 million properties. On this side of the chamber, we're often accused of voting against cuts without a valid alternative. In fact, it's been raised many times tonight. So I put this to you this evening, Councillor Senior, who's about to speak. If you won't even tax the most valuable properties in our borough, where would you find the money to protect our NHS, or nay, our council, because it is your coalition government that is taking swathes out of the budget for local councils? I urge members in this room to examine their conscience and vote against the motion.
Councillor Senior.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. Can I first of all start off by congratulating the Councillors Dodd and Lescott on their maiden speeches. I think that shows what a breadth and depth of talent we are pleased to have on the Conservative benches on this Council. And perhaps I can also congratulate the Labour opposition on their bravery in defending their own policies when so few other Labour politicians and so few other Labour councillors have been doing so. Let's look what Diane Abbott MP, a well-known extreme right-winger, I'm sure you will agree, has said. This is a tax on Londoners, she said. The same thing was said by David Lammy, another very hard-line individual. It will have a dysfunctional effect of London, said Diane Abbott. Well, quite right, because all the money will be raised in London, but very little money will actually be spent in London. Tessa Jowell, this will tax people out of their family homes, she says. The elderly will bear the brunt, she said. John Mills, a very big Labour donor. You're all going to Robert Dyers to see JML Limited, all those videos, well, that's him. People could end up in negative equity on their mortgages as a result of this tax. And no wonder, as we've already seen, the very fact it's been proposed has knocked the bottom out of some levels of the market. Glenda Jackson, it will be disastrous, she says. Now, I know she's an actress, can exaggerate a little bit, but disastrous is a pretty big statement. But let's look at local governments. Let's look at local governments to neighbouring councils. The Labour group leader, who is such a person in Kensington and Chelsea, called the policy bonkers. Emma Dent-Code, leader of the Labour group in Kensington and Chelsea Council, saying, we're rebelling because it's bonkers. Then we have Hammersmith and Fulham. A borough, yes, I know, unfortunately, slightly unexpectedly, it did vote Labour at the last elections. Well, what's happened? In October, 6 weeks ago, all the Labour councillors at the meeting unanimously backed a motion which stated the council should lobby against the mansion tax. And no wonder, because it is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. First of all, because it's an anti-London tax, as I've already said. Secondly, because it's affecting people who do not necessarily have huge levels of income. They may have struck lucky and moved into a house many years ago, which has increased in value, and yet they're being expected to pay for that increase either now, or if they can't afford it, it's yet another death tax the Labour Party wants to impose upon them. We already have extremely high property taxes, extremely high inheritance taxes compared to worldwide in this country, and yet the Labour Party wants to tax more. Yet the changes to stamp duty mean that you pay once, you pay up front, when you can afford it, it's clear, and that's when it's charged, and that's why it is a better system. Now, Councillor Daly challenged me to think of a few areas in which I could think of savings for central government. I said on aviation I could talk a long time. I could talk a very long time. And let's look at one in particular, because it's having a go at the Liberal Democrats. And I think we can all agree on that one. The Department of Business, Innovation and Skills spends something like £35,000 to create a job. Leeds City Council, which I believe is governed by the Labour Party, can do the same for £7,500. We can make enormous savings from the skills budget that is wasted by Bizzle at the moment. That's just one example. We can make very considerable savings in other areas of government. Let's take another one I think we can all agree on, and that is corporate welfare. Not individual welfare, corporate welfare. The fact at the moment, bizarrely, we are giving anything up to £45 billion a year in tax breaks to businesses. Taxes should be low and simple, not complicated with endless tax breaks. And that perhaps leads me to finish up these remarks. Something that was said just over 50 years ago. It was a speech called A Time for Choosing. It was given then by a man who later became one of the greatest presidents we've had in the United States. It was a speech that first brought into the public consciousness. I read it again today. But we also have a time for choosing ourselves next May. Do we want a government that wants to bring tax down, to have a smaller state? Or do we want a government that takes every opportunity to put up tax and to tax on the basis of envy? I know what choice I would make.
Sorry, let me repeat that. The motion now before the Council is that proposed by Councillor Senior and seconded by Councillor Govinia as set out in item 19 of the agenda. Please indicate by a show of hands those for the motion.
Those against?
And those against? The motion is carried 35 to 14. Councillor Sellers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Given the lateness of the hour, I move that the Council now dispose of the remaining business on the agenda under provisions of Standing Order 32.
Is that seconded?
Is that agreed?
Is that agreed?
Okay, we vote then.
Can we have a vote?
On this on
Right. Those in favour of the motion? Those against?
Hold on, we haven't counted it.
All right. Well, I thought
those in favour.
I apologise. I thought I saw a majority. But, those in favour. Those against. The motion is carried 34-12. So we now move on to Executive Report number 2, Adult Care and Health OSC. Councillor Madden.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 are both for information.
Is that agreed? Housing and Regeneration OSC. Councillor Ellis. paragraph 3 for information and paragraph 4. Thank you. Education and Children's Services OSC, Councillor Mrs. Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Paragraph 5 is for information. Paragraph 6, I think, is opposed. Yes.
We need to do a vote.
3514, thank you.
Well, hold on. I think you need a vote, in fairness to Councillor Grimston. You're going to have to have a vote. You'll have to have a vote.
All right, well, we're delighted to take care of Councillor Grimston. Those in favour? Those against? The motion is carried 35-14.